Hey, good people. Welcome in. Dr. Lund here. Although there was a very long trial for Alex Murdoch, with the decision being guilty of both the murders of his wife Maggie and his son Paul, this seems like the case that just keeps on giving. There are so many threads of corruption, manipulation, criminal acts related to this family that it seems like this family will continue to go through probably a lot of litigation in the near future. The case that I've been spending a lot of time reviewing and researching is the death of Stephen Smith, that possibly has some threads back to the Murdoch family. Whether it becomes uncovered that there was an association with the Murdochs, the one thing I think after hearing some of this information we may all agree on is that this case was significantly mishandled. Before we jump in with both feet, if you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope you will subscribe and like and leave comments. And if you are a subscriber, welcome back. It's good to see you. And as well, I hope you like this and leave me some comments about your thoughts. Let's get to it. Stephen Smith was a 19-year-old nursing student from Hampton, South Carolina, who was found dead in the middle of the road in the early morning hours of July 8, 2015. He was found about 3 miles away from where his car had ran out of gas. The gas cap was unscrewed and hanging, and his wallet was found in his car. This young man was found in the middle of Sandy Run Road in Hampton County with a 7-inch gash to his right side of his forehead, some scratches to his hands and his arms, with basically at that time no other major injuries identified, and fully clothed with his loosely tied shoes still intact and on his feet. One of the main reasons I'm reviewing this case is because in 2016, the case was noted to have gone cold, and we'll get into the details in a minute. But June 22nd of 2021, SLED, which is short for South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, opened an investigation into Stephen Smith's death. So we don't know exactly why and what was found. There is some speculation that when investigators were investigating Maggie and Paul Murdaugh's murder, they had come into some information, we don't know what, that led them to believe that this case needed to be reopened, investigated, to see what exactly had happened with this young man. Here is the 911 call that started this entire case in motion from the very beginning.
Hampton County 911, where's your emergency?
Hello, I just going down the Crocketville Road, and I see somebody laying out. He in the roadway.
Oh, in the road?
Yeah.
Somebody
going to hit him. It's dark. Somebody going to hit him.
All right, we'll get an officer headed out that way.
Okay.
All right, sir. All right.
Now, sometime after that 911 call, The Hampton County Sheriff's Department arrived on the scene. However, exactly what time they arrived is not very clear from the documentation. As this scenario goes forward, keep in mind we are dealing with 3 separate law enforcement agencies. One is the local Hampton County Sheriff's Department. The second is the Highway Patrol, totally different agency. The third is the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, which is SLED. Knowing these 3 agencies is really one of the keys to kind of understanding how things have gotten so complex and so muddled in trying to figure out who's doing what for this particular case. Okay, so moving on, once the Hampton County Sheriff's Department comes on the scene, they somehow determine that this appears to be a hit-and-run situation. So what they then do is they call the Highway Patrol, because that's more in their purview, is looking at traffic laws, traffic investigations. So they are then called to the scene, again thinking that Stephen was involved in a hit-and-run situation. Now, during this time, from the crime scene notes, the notes indicated that the coroner, Ernie J. Washington, and the deputy coroner, Kelly Green, were on the scene. However, they ruled Stephen's death as a shooting homicide. There was a note that an EMS worker had stated that Stephen had sustained a projectile wound to his head, and generally projectile wounds or injuries can be caused from firearms or some type of explosive propellant, something of that nature, which then entails a whole lot of specialized expertise in ballistics. So at this point, thinking that they have a homicide by shooting on their hands, now the agency SLED, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Department, was called to the scene, again because it was a homicide, and that's what they deal with. Okay, so we've got these 3 agencies at the scene. And so Highway Patrol, they're looking for any kind of evidence of a hit and run. SLED's looking for evidence of a homicide. I'm not quite sure what the deputy, the sheriff deputy office is doing, but the outcome of all these folks on the scene is they found no evidence of any bullet casing, tire marks, screech marks, gunshot residue, no vehicle debris, nothing that supports either one of those scenarios. However, because the coroner noted that this was a homicide, even though it wasn't a shooting homicide, but it was a homicide, then Stephen had to have an examination autopsy by the pathologist, who is Dr. Aaron Preswell. Pathologist is a medical doctor, and this was at the Medical University of South Carolina. And so the autopsy was conducted, and the findings of the autopsy was blunt force head trauma due to a motor vehicle crash. Now, it seemed like nobody during the investigation agreed with the pathologist's findings. But interestingly, usually in these scenarios, investigators will attend the autopsy and lend more information that they're privy to the pathologist. However, the investigators with the highway patrol were told by both SLED and the sheriff's office that they didn't need to attend the autopsy. Now, my interpretation of that is that because nobody believed this was related to a hit and run accident, which would be, again, sort of the territory of the highway patrol, their presence wasn't warranted since their investigation found no evidence that there was, in fact, any hit and run. So everybody, I think, was quite surprised at the pathologist's findings of this being related to a motor vehicle crash. Okay, this is just a reminder. This is my interpretation of my research and the documents I reviewed, and so I may not be on target with everything, but again, trying to sort out the territory of each of these agencies has been challenging, to say the least. And I think, as we'll talk about at the end of this video, that certainly could contribute to a lot of the problematic things that have happened in Stephen's case as well as in the Murdoch case. Okay, so now I'm thinking that because the pathologist related Stephen's blunt force head trauma to a vehicle crash, that now the highway patrol, much to their shock and dismay probably, they were now the assigned agency to investigate this case. And although agencies cross over in law enforcement, help each other collaborate, have their specialties, generally, the highway patrol is not usually the agency that investigates murders. And at this point in time, it appears that I think all of the agencies were not in agreement that Stephen's cause of death was due to any vehicle crash, or basically a hit and run. From some pieces of the documents I could review, the disagreement between the highway patrol, who did several investigations regarding the possibility of a hit and run and continued to find no evidence, and the pathologist's findings that Stephen's death was related to a vehicle crash or hit and run. This was a very hot topic where there is indication in the notes that, in quotes, there is a heated conversation between the investigator and the pathologist, to the point where the pathologist had been documented as saying, when the investigator asked, "What evidence do you have that this is how this happened to this young man?" that she basically said, "Well, that's your job. You need to figure that out." Okay, I've got to say, doing healthcare investigations for about 23 years, when I see fights on paper between professionals, it's kind of that idea where there's smoke, there's fire. Now, I may not always know the issues, but when I see that in writing in somebody's notes or progress notes, that tells me that we have some pretty intense issues that can certainly, absolutely, without question, affect the outcome of whatever the issue or the project or the findings should be with that kind of paper fight. It's really very unprofessional, but it gives you a sense that something isn't right. Okay, so here is sort of the algorithm. We have a pathologist who puts down the manner and cause of death. Now that documentation then leads to sort of which of these agencies takes the lead in the investigation. So pathologist says it's related to a vehicle. She says crash, but it's hit and run. So then that then is distributed to the highway patrol to do the investigation. So during this time, the highway patrol has got to find out after the autopsy was completed where Stephen's body is, since they are now in charge of the investigation. And they have to make phone calls, and they find that he's at a funeral home. However, the clothes that he was wearing when he was found have been unsecured. And at this point in time, now there is a break in the chain of custody, which you don't want in an investigation. So we have that as a problem as well. So now at this point in time, as the investigation continues, interviews are done with family members, even though this investigation is supposedly focusing on a hit and run. But, and I think to their credit, the highway patrol interviews Stephen's family, people who knew him, and with one of the family members' interviews, it was mentioned that Randy Murdoch had called the family within 24 hours of Stephen's death to say that he would take their case and he would do it for free. Interestingly, he was the first person to call after the coroner called the family to tell them about Stephen's death. Now, I believe, if I'm correct, one of the attorneys in the Stephen Smith case reported that Randy Murdoch has denied making that phone call. So we don't know. However, if that happened, that would lead to a number of questions about how did he know? How did he know so quickly? What's the communication chain? And from there are just a million more questions that would be asked in that situation. In addition, both this family member and Stephen's mother, when asked about if there was any rumors as to who might have problems with Stephen, both of them cited the Murdoch boys. Interestingly, Stephen's mother had said that she had heard rumblings or rumors about the Murdoch boys and added whoever they are. So it sounded to me that she did not know of them or have a history with them. In fact, it's been reported, I cannot verify it because I don't have all the documents, that the Murdoch boys, or Buster Murdoch, or the Murdochs, were cited in at least 40 times in the investigation documentation. That's interesting. But what I find, again, extremely confusing is in none of the documentation that I'm aware of was there any consideration that Stephen had been beaten to death, that he had been hit with some object to cause that 7.25 gash in his forehead on the right side. There was no consideration of that option, which somebody in the medical field is very, very confusing. And for whatever reason, some of the areas of documentation that talk about the Murdoch family was not reported in the investigator's notes, nor was any of the Murdochs ever interviewed about the situation. So consequently, over time, and not that long of a time, the case was deemed as a cold case in 2016. So we have the death of a 19-year-old young nursing student whose cause and manner of death are actually disputed by the evidence of 3 agencies. And the agency probably least prepared to do a murder investigation is put in charge because of the documentation of a pathologist that in a year's time deem it as a cold case, possibly because it doesn't fit any kind of traffic law issue or investigation that they would be or have the expertise in conducting. And no indication that anybody at least had written down that they suspected that this young man was beaten to death. And now we have an order for exhumation of his body, which will be interesting because it's not really the physical autopsy findings that are being disputed as far as his injuries in that sense, but it's really the manner in how he received those injuries that will be disputed, and I'm not quite sure how that will be determined by exhuming his body, but we'll see. So at this point, SLED has opened up the investigation, and that is as of June 22nd, 2021. They are in charge of the investigation, and we will be following to see what happens from here regarding an investigation done by an agency that should have expertise in a murder investigation, although some could dispute that from the Murdoch trial itself. However, what we want is justice for Stephen's family and for Stephen. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for following along this path with me as I try to untease some of the details. And as I said, this is my interpretation, my speculation of what happened in the past with this case. And so I hope we will see much more effective investigation going forward now that SLED has had it since 2021. And hopefully we will hear some forward movement. So again, thank you for listening. I hope you subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Like the video, leave me comments, leave me thoughts on your interpretation or information that you may know of. I enjoy reading it. I enjoy hearing your wonderful and profound comments. See you soon.